Hello, and welcome to this video overview, in which I, Lukas, discuss some of the most important concepts from Chapter 7, Grammar, History, and Background, in the textbook I wrote, College Composition and Reading, Information and Strategies. Hopefully knowing a little about why our grammar system is so crazy and getting a little insight into how much you already know can make grammar a bit less scary. The first thing that I want to address in our discussion about grammar is the fear and hatred that it so often inspires, often due to overly enthusiastic teachers with red pens. Too many students have spent years being told that the way they speak and write is incorrect, and yet the actual rules that are supposed to be applied too often seem to not make any sense and to be totally arbitrary. People who have a hard time using, quote, correct grammar, end quote, are often made to feel inferior or ashamed of themselves. I find this unconscionable, so I'm going to teach you some of the real history and background about where standard English grammar came from to hopefully make using it seem less intimidating and value-laden. Even I, an English teacher who's always had a good instinctive grasp of grammar due to the amount of reading that I do, ended high school and even college hating grammar, being intimidated by it, and only sort of understanding, even if that understanding was better than most people's. However, that brings me to the first point that I'll be making. I had a good instinctive grasp of grammar from my reading, and the fact is, everyone has an excellent grasp of the underlying syntax and grammatical idiosyncrasies of their own native language. However, a language isn't really one thing, so your native language may be a dialect of English different than the prestige dialect, standard English, which is more formal and restricted than most of the common dialects. However, that doesn't mean that there's something inherently better about standard English than the way we speak with our friends. That's just the dialect that happened to get lucky. You know, it wasn't a logical decision when you see how many of the rules make no sense at all. This is the list of topics that we'll be discussing in this PowerPoint, and we'll come back to it. For now, let's talk about the first topic on the list, the fact that everyone is an expert in the underlying syntax and grammatical idiosyncrasies of their own native language. We all know much more about the difficult and complicated grammar of our own language than we often realize or give ourselves credit for. Just because you might not know the label doesn't mean that you don't know the concept or how to use it. For example, this chart looks horribly intimidating and complicated, but you already know even more than appears here. For example, if you're a native speaker of English, you would never say, "The trash company came today and collected all of the garbages." You know it has to be "collected all the garbage," no matter how many garbage cans got picked up. One thing that we're almost never taught and yet usually know is the difference between a mass noun and a count noun. Despite the fact that many people have never heard of these labels, they know you can't say, "You have very nice furnitures," or "I like those 7 chair." They know it has to be, "You have very nice furniture," or "I like those 7 chairs." There are some general guidelines on how this works. For example, most nouns referring to liquids, milk, wine, water, powders, sugar, sand, or substances, plastic, steel, are mass nouns. But a lot of them don't seem to follow any logic. For instance, vegetables are a count noun, but fruit isn't. So you say, "I like fruit," not "I like fruits," despite the fact that fruit and vegetables seem like they would be in the same category. And even though vegetables are a count noun, corn, which is a vegetable, is not. You cannot have a serving of corns at Thanksgiving. You likely know things like heat or traffic or information are mass nouns that you don't ever make plural. You can talk about pools of water, but then it's the pool that gets the S, not water. So, mass nouns are things like sunshine, air, soap, trash, applause, or luggage. You don't say, "I have 2 luggages." You have to say, "I have 2 pieces of luggage." The difference between how many or how much is the difference between a count noun or a mass noun. How much water versus how many bottles of water. And yet, even if you've never heard of this distinction and never thought about it, you would never accidentally say, "How many monies do you have?" Any native speaker knows that the phrase is, "How much money do you have?" even if they can't explain that it's because money is a mass noun. It's part of the English grammar system that any native speaker absorbs while learning to speak the language. Despite the fact that you likely have never been taught it in school, and despite the fact that it's really unintuitive, what's a mouse noun and what's a count noun is rather random and often doesn't make logical sense, you still know how to use mass and count nouns. A noun's status as count or mass also affects other aspects of the sentence. For instance, you would talk about fewer count nouns, fewer cats, but less mass nouns, less juice. Again, you would never say that something does fewer harm if you're a native speaker, even though you've never consciously thought about it. So, like I said, this chart of grammar knowledge related to verbs looks overwhelming, but if we zoom in on one section, you can see it's merely a representation of what you already know, and not even all of that. Let's take a look. If we zoom in on the branch titled Tense, you can see that it splits into three possibilities: past tense, present tense, and future tense. The hourglass behind the line indicates that tense has to do with time, and each of the three tenses is illustrated. He ran to school, he runs to school, he will run to school. Like I said, you even know more than what's represented here, since you can also say things like, he is running to school, and he had run to school earlier, which are more complicated tenses. Again, the chart looked overwhelming, but falls short at recording what you already know, even though you've probably never considered grammar your strength. We actually have many things that are very systematic in our minds that are not taught in school. Mass nouns and count nouns are just one example. Here's another example. Take a look at these words. Do you notice anything about them? All of these words can be pronounced two ways. For example, you contract a disease, but you sign a contract. One of them is a verb, contracting a disease is something you do, and the other is a noun. A contract is a thing that you sign. The key then is the stress. The stress on the first syllable, contract, means it will be a verb. Stress on the second syllable, contract, means a noun. And this works for all of the words on this list. You discount an item as a verb, but the store offers a discount, which is a noun. You might object to what someone says as a verb, but you hold on to an object, a noun. Pause the video and take a moment to review the rest of these words to see how each one can be a noun or a verb depending on where you place the stress. Nor is that the only way we work with stress that we aren't aware of. What's the difference between a blackbird and a black bird? What about the difference between a white board and a whiteboard? They're both nouns, but in this case, the difference is whether it's a compound noun, where all the words are a single name, like the White House that the president lives in, versus a noun that's being described with an adjective, like a house that is white. Other examples include things like a greenhouse versus a greenhouse, a hot dog versus a dog who's hot, and a dark room versus a room that is dark. A dark room versus a dark room. So then, you know a lot more than you give yourself credit for. We all have these categories that we can manipulate without even thinking about, and that's something to be proud of. In addition, it may surprise you to learn that the common belief that we often speak incorrectly or make grammatical mistakes in our everyday verbal communication is not really accurate. Humans are genetically programmed to speak their native language, and as a result, people do not make mistakes that violate the underlying syntactic rules of the language. For example, no native speaker accidentally says, "I saw friend my," instead of, "I saw my friend." So as I said, everyone is an expert in the underlying syntax and grammatical idiosyncrasies of their own native language. However, that doesn't mean that you're automatically an expert. In fact, the vast majority of people struggle with at least parts of the grammar that's taught in school. This is due to the fact that English is not just a single language. Different people speak it differently according to location, culture, and more. But the academic and professional communities say that written language should follow the conventions of the standard English dialect, even though that's not actually spoken anywhere. Spoken dialects vary widely from region to region and even group to group in the same region, while standard English is the standard in the entire United States and even to a large extent Britain and the rest of the world. There are advantages to learning standard English, which we'll discuss, but it's important to realize that it's an artificial language. No one speaks standard English natively. One reason that academic writing often differs from how we speak naturally is the fact that different regions and cultures have slightly different ways of communicating. Linguist John McWhorter says, quote, "What we call a language is really a bundle of dialects," end quote. Think about it. People in the South have one accent and say y'all, and people in upstate New York have another accent and call fireflies lightning bugs, refer to a big nose as a schnoz, and talk about critters. Whether you refer to a certain type of sandwich as a hoagie or a sub, or call the sugary carbonated drink soda or pop, depends on where you live. This can even happen within a state. In Northern California, hella is a way of saying a lot of, whereas in Southern California, wicked means very, as in wicked cool. But neither is used much in the other area. There are even dialects that are more about the ethnic communities than location, the most famous of which is Black English, sometimes called Ebonics or African American Vernacular, which has different rules for conjugating verbs and often omits to be verbs. So, for example, they might say, she a cheerleader, rather than she is a cheerleader. It also has differences in word use, like the use of up in she all up in my house. Again, any language, English included, is not really a language. It's a bundle of dialects, which in combination constitute what the language is and how it's used. Dialects are variations on a theme, and none of them are intrinsically better or worse. Each is correct in the discourse community that uses it, and odd in the ones that don't. Let's look at some more examples from here in the United States about how even today, with mass media, regional differences still exist, even though everyone is speaking English. Here's an illustrated example of the way that language can change over distance. The word you use in general to mean soft drinks changes depending on where you live, even though we're all speaking English. As you can see, there's quite a bit of variation, and that's just for one commonly used word in one country where national radio, television, and internet means that regional variations are a lot less pronounced than they were a couple of hundred years ago. And yet, you can see in the red area, people call it soda. In the blue area, people call it pop. In the green area, people call it Coke, regardless of what type of soda they're drinking. And the yellow part, which you can barely even see, people call it soft drinks. And this next slide actually shows that the previous one was really simplified. There is a lot going on with what people call their beverages. Nor is that the only drink-related controversy. Something simple as the thing you drink out of at the hall in school can be a water fountain, red, a drinking fountain, blue, or a bubbler, green, depending on where you live. Staying on the topic of water, what do you call those little mini lobster things that you find in ponds, streams, and lakes? I'm used to calling them crawdads, and I live in the green area, the northern part of California. Other people might call them crawfish, marked in red, or crayfish, marked in blue, and some have never heard of the critter at all, marked in yellow. What do you call a traffic situation where you have to go in a circle instead of a cross at an intersection? Well, people marked in red call it a traffic circle. People marked in blue call it a roundabout. Marked in green, they have no word for this. And marked in yellow, they call it a rotary. When you hear someone mention the city, what city do you think they're talking about? Well, it depends on where you live. You can see that people who live near New York City are the most likely, marked in red, to think of that as the city, with many other people in the country thinking the same, marked by the green and yellow for about half the people thinking that. You can see that near other major urban areas, no one thinks that they're talking about New York City. In the upper left-hand map, the people next to New York City believe that you're talking about New York City. In the lower left-hand map, only people right next to Chicago think that Chicago is the city. In the lower right-hand map, only people who live right next to Boston think that you mean Boston. And in the upper right-hand map, marked Other, you can see that there are areas around each of the major cities where people agree on which city the city is. Notice that San Francisco didn't even rate a listing other than Other, despite the fact that we've got the largest red splotch out of any of these maps. So, where do you suppose that the researchers for this study were from? My guess is that most of them were from Chicago and Boston, which is why they included their cities in this listing, even though almost nobody in the country thinks of their city as the city. Now for my favorite map from this study, since my response to what to call it was, "This exists?" What do you call a drive-through liquor store? You can see that in this case, the names sort of align with state borders because legislation is going to designate whether or not a drive-through liquor store is something that's even legal at all. They are not legal in California, Nevada, Washington, and many of the western states. And so that you can see people in those areas are marked in red for "I have never heard of such a thing." The blue areas indicate we have these in my area, but have no special term for them. The green is Other, but my favorite, that yellow area over in the side, is a brew-through. A drive-through liquor store is a brew-through. So, the government can affect dialect. Locations like how close to a city can affect it, and just odd changes that happen, like with soda and crawdads. Now that you have seen how language is not one single thing, but a collection of dialects that differ in a million small details from each other, let's talk about a misconception that's hard to avoid. Now, despite what you may have been told, no dialect is intrinsically better than any other dialect. It's like you're looking at a bunch of different breeds of dogs. The German Shepherd and the Poodle look very different from each other, but they're both dogs. One is not a bad or corrupted version of the other one. In actual fact, people's sense of what language should sound like, or how it should be used, is more a matter of fashion than logic, just as many people's preference for one type of dog over another is a matter of personal taste, not some intrinsic value difference between the breeds. Even if you think of dialects as being either standard English or non-standard English, non-standard does not mean substandard, even though it's often perceived that way, particularly due to the value placed on mastering standard English in academic and professional life. But languages are actually bundles of equally valid dialects, of which the standard in any given language is just a dialect that in some sense got lucky. All of the dialects in a language develop from the same ancestor. For example, at one point, Latin was diverging in different parts of the Roman Empire. A writer in 63 AD lamented that there was one dialect in what is today France, another in Italy, and another dialect in Spain. He said, quote, "It has gotten to the point that the student of Latin is now writing in what is to them an artificial language." End quote. Writers at the time lamented how horrible and incomprehensible Latin was becoming outside of Rome. Eventually, over time, these dialects diverged so far that they became separate languages altogether: modern-day French, Italian, Spanish, and the other Romance languages. We don't think that one of these languages is better than another one, or that somehow they are bad Latin, even though they all started out as Latin. Similarly, all dialects are equally valid variations of a language arising from geographic or cultural differences, or from isolation. One way to think of dialects is as branches of a single older language that are on the way to becoming new language, but have only progressed part of the way. Americans, Scottish people, Australians, and people from England are all speaking in dialects that developed from Middle English, but each developed in different ways, and all are equally valid to their speakers. If global communication and writing weren't such strong influences in the modern world, each of these would continue to diverge until they were all different languages, as happened to French and Spanish from the original Italian. So then, we've now talked about how you're actually an expert in your native language, but that the dialect you speak is slightly different from standard English that's taught in schools. The question then is, why did standard English get picked and not the way that I speak? Well, I'm about to answer that, and the answer is that it got lucky. Languages gradually changing over time is a natural trend throughout history. However, particularly once literacy becomes widely taught, writing standardizes language. And when writing begins to be standardized, the question becomes which dialect or way of speaking is going to be the one that is preserved and used. Which one will be taught in schools and used in formal and public situations? Usually, the dialect that's chosen is picked because it has some kind of prominence or social prestige. For example, in Italian, the type that is standard today, and the one that you learned if you took Italian in school, is the Tuscan dialect used by Dante, who wrote Dante's Inferno, and a few other famous writers, which then became seen as the language of culture, what people now think of as, quote, real Italian, even though there were plenty of other dialects to choose from, such as Sicilian or the dialect spoken near Naples that's used in much of Italian music today. So really, it's a matter of geopolitics. Whichever area is most highly regarded or most powerful will likely end up imposing its dialect on the rest of the country, not because it's better, just because it has more power. The same thing applies to English as well. The standard English that we speak now just happened to be the dialect spoken by the upper classes in London, which ended up having a certain prestige or authority due to the fact that London was the center of political power, where the royal court had been established since before 1000 AD, and it was where the universities were founded. The dialect that the professors at the university spoke ended up seeming like how educated people talk, or later, the right way to talk. But if universities had happened to become established in a different part of England, we would speak and write completely differently. Before the standardization, there were lots of different dialects, each of which was considered to be the right way of speaking by the people who spoke it. This patchwork of dialects is clearly illustrated by one of the earliest printers in England, William Caxton. Unusually for the time, he chose to do most of his printing in the local vernacular, English. Caxton printed in the mid to late 1400s, and he wrote in the preface of one of his books that it was difficult to know what dialect to publish the books in. In his time, there were 5 main dialects of English in England, and many more minor variations of those main 5. To illustrate the difficulties, Caxton tells a story about a Londoner who goes to Kent, which is only about 40 miles away, and stops by a house to get some food. However, after listening to his request for eggs, the housewife said that she was sorry, but that she didn't speak any French. Caxton tells us that the Londoner was angry because he didn't speak French either, but their dialects were so different she couldn't understand him. London's words for eggs was egges, whereas in Kent they were called iren. This also illustrates how the London dialect is the one that has come down to us today, with the others virtually disappearing. Contributing to this problem was the common practice in those days of printing in Latin, which, being a dead language, did not change or have divergent dialects. In England, France, Spain, and most other European countries at that time, nearly all literature was written in Latin, not the local language, in part to avoid having to choose between the wide range of regional dialects, and in part because that gave them an international market, since books tended to be hideously expensive. So then, what is today Standard English became the standard via chance influences, not inherent worth or quality. It became the language, with the other dialects dying out or becoming more similar to it as it spread via increased literacy and education. But the choice of the London dialect for the standard was not due to any inherent superiority or commonality. However, when a country begins to establish itself and begin to gain a national identity, there are many reasons to create a single standard for the language of the country. So then, how do we pick the one that everybody's going to write in? And what makes the one that's been chosen, called Standard English, better than how you talk to your friends? In short, it isn't. But long ago, scholars agreed on Standard English as the dialect for everyone to learn. And since writing a language tends to slow down the language change, we have features of written Standard English that have fallen out of use in most spoken English, such as the use of the word whom. So, you know that you are an expert in your own language, but there are lots of different dialects. The one we learn in school today is just the one that got lucky. Now's the time to move on to the last point that I want to make in order to help you see grammar as less intimidating. Parts of it don't even make sense. Let's take a look at how and why. In fact, one of the reasons that formal, written language can be so different than what we speak has to do with the effects of writing. Once a language is regularly written down and literacy is widespread, then the language change tends to slow down or even freeze to a large extent. We can see evidence of this in the fact that Shakespeare, who died in 1616, would have found Beowulf, written about AD 1000, incomprehensible, and yet we can puzzle through Shakespeare, even though there is about the same number of centuries between us and Shakespeare as there is between Shakespeare and the unknown author of Beowulf. The larger difference can even be seen to the casual observer. The one on the left looks a little bit funny, with things that look like an F where they actually meant an S, and some archaic spelling, like the two L's in the word comical, and a bit of older vocabulary. No one has said forsooth for a long time. However, the one on the right is completely indecipherable. And when we type out and translate the first line of each one, the differences in the rate of change are even clearer. This difference in the rate of the change from the English language is due to writing's increasing role in the English language from the year 1500 to the present, versus the lack of widespread literacy from the years 1000 AD, which is the approximate year the only existing manuscript of Beowulf, to 1500 AD, which is around 50 years before Shakespeare was born. You can see that the Merchant of Venice's first line is, "In sooth, I know not why I am so sad. It wearies me, you say it wearies you. But how I caught it, found it, or came by it, what stuff 'tis made of, whereof it is born, I am to learn." This means approximately, truthfully, I don't know why I'm so sad. I don't like it, and you don't either, but why I feel like this, I just don't know. On the other hand, the transcript of Beowulf's first line is, "Hwat, we gardena in giordigum, bio di crinogium brime giofranon, hudai plingzelen frimondon." This means approximately, "Hark, Praise of the prowess of the people kings, of the spear-armed Danes, in the days long sped, we have heard, and what honor the Aethelings won. You can see we didn't even have a chance at guessing that one. So then, one effect of widespread literacy is that spelling begins to be taught, and thus becomes frozen, even though pronunciation continues to undergo the organic changes that are natural to any language. Notice that in spoken English, you say vegetables, or even veggies, leaving out the middle E. You do not say veg-eatables, despite the fact that that's the way it's spelled. And many other words have changed their spoken pronunciation as well. Most people say gonna, or coulda, or probably, instead of the older versions preserved in spelling, going to, could have, probably. The great vowel shift is another reason spelling doesn't match pronunciation. Long vowels changed in England between 1350 and 1700. Through the great vowel shift, all Middle English long vowels changed their pronunciation, though the short ones stayed the same. If you speak another European language like German or Italian, their vowels stayed the same. Because English spelling became standardized in the 15th or 16th centuries, the great vowel shift is responsible for many of the peculiarities of English spelling, where the spelling doesn't match the pronunciation. Nor was that enough confusion. Sometimes spelling is even based on what people thought things should be. For example, there was an era when everyone idolized Latin and thought of it as the best language and what a language should be, due in part to its antiquity and the number of great works that were written in it, as well as the fact that much of the serious literature and scholarship was conducted in Latin long after it was a dead language. At that time, many words were changed to make them seem more Latin. For instance, it's during that time that a B got added to the word doubt because it was descended from the Latin word dubitare, to doubt, even though the Middle English version of the word was douten, D-O-U-T-E-N. As I mentioned in the chapter, descriptive approaches to language simply record how it is used, whereas prescriptive approaches try and create a dialect, or just rules, to be used in formal situations. Descriptivists assume that people who speak the language know how to do it correctly, and they try and figure out the existing underlying system. Prescriptivists assume that they know better than anyone else what it should be like, and enthusiastically try to convince everyone that anyone who doesn't talk their way is doing it wrong. One discovered the underlying system, the other imposes their own. An example of a descriptive linguist would be the one who divided out the letters into vowels and their consonants. Vowels are said with no stoppage anywhere in your vocal tract. You can think of them as airy. Consonants, on the other hand, have a restriction or a closure at some point in your vocal tract. The prescriptivists had particular influence in the 17 and 1800s when England was being standardized, and many of their ideas have hung on through today. One of the outdated ideals that still influences how English is taught today is the reverence in which Latin was held. Due to its complicated nature, antiquity, and the number of classical works written in it, as well as its re-emerging place as the language of education for hundreds of years beginning in the Renaissance, Latin was seen as the best language for much of Europe's history. This fetish for Latin as a language somehow better than English has had a lot of effects. For instance, many grammatical rules taught in schools today were actually made up by Robert Loth in his book A Short Introduction to English Grammar, first published in 1762. He felt English needed to be fancied up in order to be taken seriously and to be on par with Latin. Two instances of grammatical rules that are the most controversial and annoying today were both handed down to us by Loth. One is ending a sentence with a preposition, and the other is the use of whom as the object form of who, i.e., for whom are you looking versus who are you looking for. In Loth's time, both ending a sentence with a preposition and using who instead of whom as an object happened all the time. People did both of them and thought nothing of it. But Lowth felt we should be more like Latin, and in Latin, you can't have a preposition at the end. It just doesn't go there. It would be like saying, I saw a boy the. You just can't do it. It doesn't work. But English is not Latin, as you may have noticed. Unfortunately for us, Lowth thought it should be, so he just transposed the rule about prepositions over to English. However, it seems to me that it's counterproductive to try and force this rule that never even made sense in the first place on people 300 years later. So you'll notice that in my textbook, I have a more informal type of writing that often does end a sentence with a preposition. That increasing informality is one of the ways that English has been changing, particularly over the last 20 or 30 years. English has become much more informal. The word whom is also an interesting case. People see the use of whom as a marker of education, but really it's sort of a historical curiosity that doesn't make sense in modern English, because for one thing, we don't need it for our sentences to be clearly understood as Latin did. So, a lot of what grammar is ends up being deciding how much the opinion of the discourse community is that you have to use certain conventions in order to be respected or taken seriously. It's not a matter of intrinsic correctness or incorrectness, but rather agreed upon conventions that change over time. However, with that said, it's important to learn those conventions so that you can choose to use them or not use them consciously, thinking of their utility as well as the effect that your decision will have on the perception of you and your writing by your reader. Interestingly, at the time that Lowth was writing, whom was on its way out and was kind of on its last legs. His contemporary, Jonathan Swift, doesn't use it, and Lowth even criticizes him for saying, quote, he knows who it is proper to expose, end quote. So people who were esteemed writers, who are still famous hundreds of years later, were not using it. But Lowth, a guy you've never heard of, didn't like it. So here it is, nearly 300 years later. So, it's not that we shouldn't be concerned with elegance of language or clarity or effectiveness of communication, but it's good to be aware of the arbitrariness and senselessness of some of these rules, particularly when so often people are made to feel inferior due to the way that they speak or write. In reality, it's more about personal preference than actual correctness. Languages are idiosyncratic and eccentric naturally. Another point I want to make is about how we see writing. In modern times, we often unconsciously think that writing is merely speech recorded, which isn't really accurate and can inhibit mastery of formal writing's conventions. For almost the entire history of writing, you didn't just scrawl out a shopping list or jot down a quick note. Writing was something that was done only by a select few and was regarded extremely seriously. It was used almost exclusively for religious purposes, highly formal record-keeping, and high literature. Written documents were treasured and sweated over. This meant that you usually didn't write the way people around you actually spoke. You wanted to write better than that, which resulted in people writing in either a highly fossilized version of the language, or even in another, quote, better, end quote, language, such as Latin, or, in Norman England, French. You didn't write casually. You wrote to exhibit your education while recording important events, sharing serious, important discussions, or crafting highly artistic works of linguistic skill. Although the divide between writing and speaking is no longer quite as extreme as it used to be, we don't write in an entirely different language, we still don't write the same way that we speak. For example, we don't write vegetables, even though that's how we say it, without the E between veg and tables. Nor would we write says, S-E-Z, or gonna, G-O-N-N-A, in an educational or professional setting, despite the fact that these are commonly pronounced that way, even by highly educated individuals. Instead, we learn the conventions of a somewhat fossilized, more formal version of our language that we call Standard English, even though it's not how we tend to speak, send texts, or jot notes. It's the standard for formal writing and a way of displaying education, despite its lack of correspondence with how language is used orally. Just as there's times when it's appropriate to lie around comfortably in your sweatpants, there are also times when it's appropriate to dress in less comfortable, fancier clothing, particularly when you want to make a good impression, such as at a job interview. In the same way, your natural, unconscious speech patterns are perfectly appropriate in many situations, but should be adjusted to a more artificial and cleaned up version in others, particularly when you want to be perceived as intelligent and educated. With that in mind, we'll be looking next time at grammatical categories and how you can use them to enhance your understanding and use of that odd dialect, Standard English, that can have such an effect on how other people perceive not only your level of education, but even your intelligence and worth, however unjust that can be. It's not fair or right, but it's the way the world works, and thus it's worth it to take the time to master this fossilized, formal dialect.